April 1943. Liverpool meets the morning with a wet quay and low clouds over the river, with sirens and short ship whistles sounding between them. Out in the roadstead, a convoy is slowly assembling, the future ONS-5, 42 merchant ships forming up in columns under the British flag. In the documents, it is just another outward north slow, a slow northbound passage that must take grain, fuel, military equipment and spare parts for Allied forces to Canada. In the engine rooms, sailors from the United Kingdom, Canada and other countries of the British Commonwealth check oil pressure and water temperature and listen to the shafts trembling at low revolutions before the long crossing of the North Atlantic. Command of the escort has been given to British officer Conrad Peter Gretton. His escort group is listed in the documents as B7. It includes the destroyer HMS Duncan, several Flower-class corvettes, among them HMS Vidette and HMS Sunflower, as well as auxiliary ships with depth-charge armament and modern communications equipment. Gretton's task is formulated simply: to lead the convoy from a British port across the North Atlantic toward Halifax and not allow kriegsmarine submarines to break the protective ring. On the bridge of the flagship, they maintain contact with the Western Approaches Command in Liverpool and receive situation reports on the main convoy routes and the latest attacks. Over the previous 3 years, the Battle of the Atlantic has turned into a separate front of the Second World War, where German submarines are trying to cut the supply line between North America and the United Kingdom. The U-boat fleet under Karl Dönitz at the Befehlshaber der U-Boote headquarters uses the Wolfpack tactic, when several Type 7 submarines and Type 9 submarines in turn attack the same convoy, wearing down the escort. Merchant ships from the United States and Canada have more than once gone to the bottom, in those zones that staff charts mark as the Mid-Atlantic Gap, a stretch of ocean that for a long time was beyond the reach of aircraft from shore airfields. Therefore, in the spring of 1943, every column and every escort ship of this convoy is important for supplying Britain, supporting Allied operations in North Africa, and preparing future actions in Europe. While the cargo ships slowly move off from the pier toward the exit, deck crews on HMS Duncan and HMS Vidette secure life rafts, check the gear for dropping depth charges and the mooring bits. On the masts, they raise the antennas of the HF/DF high-frequency direction-finding sets. Communications are checked with short test transmissions to shore and to neighbouring ships, noting the stability of reception. In the corvette's wheelhouse, the engineer switches on the power to the Type 271 shipborne radar set. The centimetric radar is supposed to help detect a target in fog, and at night at a distance of several kilometres nearby, the radio operator writes in the log the frequencies on which submarines usually come on the air when they send short reports to Dönitz's staff about convoys sighted. The coastal command radio stations transmit another summary of dangerous areas, listing the grid references where Type 7 submarines have recently attacked Allied caravans. On the flagship, Gretton receives this information and makes marks on the chart, bending the route slightly so as to bypass the most saturated enemy zones, and at the same time keep an economical track and acceptable fuel consumption. And before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel, and if you're enjoying this one, don't forget to subscribe and smash a like. In conversation with his officers, he emphasises that this sailing is only one of many, and that the main goal is to bring as many ships as possible to the Canadian coast, preserving the cargoes for the fronts that depend on these supplies. On the corvette's deck, the port lights slowly sink behind the horizon line at the sailors' backs, and instead only the yellow dots of the stern lights of the nearest ships within the convoy formation remain. When the shore lights finally disappear beyond the horizon line and the cities left behind, the sound becomes more even, and all that can be heard is the water striking away from the bows. The sky stretches as a solid grey band, and short confirmations go out over the radio network that all columns are in their places and the speed is being kept at about 13 kilometers per hour, which corresponds to 7 knots. In the radio rooms of the escort ships, the watch crews in turn monitor the ether, noting any unusual signals that may belong to German transmitters or coastal radar stations. For those standing at the instruments, this invisible flow of messages and bearings is now more important than the empty line of ocean hidden in a hazy mist ahead. At the same time, hundreds of kilometers to the west, the tables of the Kriegsmarine operational duty staff are covered with sea charts, bearing the tracks of previous convoys and the zones of losses. From U-boat reports, the officers plan the positions of several interception groups and mark in the northern part of the Atlantic the sectors for the Star Group, the Finca Group and other formations. Each boat is to hold its own grid square and wait for the next slow convoy. One of the Type 7 submarines receives a short radio order with the designation of a new grid square, and the radio operator takes down this set of numbers and letters in a matter of seconds so that they can clear the transmission before any possible direction finding. The navigator transfers the coordinates to the chart, and the boat on the surface changes course, using the diesel engines to make its way as quickly as possible toward the zone where, according to the calculations, Convoy ONS-5 should appear. Toward nightfall on HMS Vidette, the HF/DF needle makes a sharp movement and freezes on one bearing, and the operator notes the azimuth in the log. A few minutes later, another short signal appears from the same sector, and now this looks not like a random interference, but like a submarine receiving or sending instructions. On the bridge, they report the matching bearings to Gretton, and he asks for an approximate area to be plotted on the chart, where the enemy may try to come up to the column formation over the internal communication system. A short instruction is passed to the escort ships to be ready to maneuver in this direction, without changing the overall screen pattern. Night thickens, the horizon no longer reads even as a dark strip, and the only reference points are the stern lights of the nearest ship and the glowing instrument dials. Wind from the northern part of the Atlantic raises a sea, spray reaches the bridges, and sailors on watch cling to guardrails to keep their footing. On one of the transports in the middle column, the night lookout notices off to the side a narrow pale streak crossing the course, and immediately reports to the bridge, although a few seconds later this trace is already dissolved in the swell. The message is passed on anyway to the nearest corvette, because in combination with the HF/DF bearings, any observation may indicate from where a submarine is trying to approach the convoy. A short time later, on one of the ships sailing at the tail of the column, there is first a dull blow, then a hard jolt, and the hull suddenly heels sharply to one side. A torpedo of the 533 mm caliber standard for German submarines hits in the area of the cargo hold, and water bursts inside, filling the compartments below the waterline within minutes. In the engine room, pressures jump, the instrument needles run into the red, and the crew try to stop the machinery to avoid pipe ruptures and additional damage. On neighbouring ships they see the flash, hear the fading sounds of tearing metal, and a short report of a transport hit at the rear of the formation goes out immediately over the radio network. The escort ships switch from escort mode to attack mode. On HMS Duncan they ring up full speed and turn the destroyer toward the sector from which, by rough estimate, the torpedo may have been launched. On the stern they prepare depth charges for dropping, setting the fuses to different depths, for example to 90 metres and 150 metres, in order to cover the possible downward and lateral manoeuvre of the submarine. On HMS Vidette, the Type 271 operator scans the screen, hoping to catch at least a brief trace of the target at short range if it has not yet gone deep. In the darkness above the water, they can hear the heavy cylinders of the depth charges going over the side one after another, and a few seconds later the sea surface is torn by series of tall water columns that make it clear to everyone on board that the hunt in this Atlantic night has already begun. After the series of drops, the water around the convoy stays bright with foam and flashes for a long time, and only when the last columns collapse into the waves do the destroyer and corvettes begin to move back to their positions in the screen. On the damaged transport they keep giving orders to the boats. People are pulled up onto the decks, and in the engine room the flooded compartments can no longer be brought under control, and the hull is settling ever deeper. On the flagship they record the time of impact of the 533mm torpedo, the area of the attack and the approximate direction from which the salvo may have been fired. The night report shows the first loss, and next to it a note about the heavy use of depth charges in response. A few hours after the first attack, the weather finally breaks, the wind strengthens and the sea rises so high that the bows of the cargo ships disappear into the water almost up to the deck. The upper skin of the ocean turns into a continuous grey mass, and even the signal lights in the convoy formation periodically vanish behind the crests, so that the lookouts have to strain their eyes. In such conditions, any attempt at visual observation for a submarine almost loses its meaning, because even a conning tower on the surface disappears between the waves. On the escort ships, they shift their attention to the instruments, especially to Type 271, because now only the centimetric radar can give a real picture of what is around them. On HMS Vedette in the wheelhouse they darken all unnecessary light sources, so there are no reflections from lamps on the Type 271 display. The operator sets the sensitivity so as to cut out excess interference from wavetops, and leave only stable returns that might be hulls of ships or a submarine on the surface. On the next rotation of the antenna, a thin dot appears at a range of about 4 kilometers, repeating in the same bearing and not disappearing over several sweeps. A note goes into the watch log, and on the bridge they order a slow turn to bring the bow round toward the contact. At the same time, in HMS Vedette's radio room, the HF/DF needle deflects again in the same sector, which means the German submarine has sent a short signal related to an attack or a query to headquarters. The bearing from the direction finder and the bearing of the Type 271 return match, closely enough to assume that the target is in this area and moving near the convoy. When Gretton receives the report over the internal line, he confirms the corvette's manoeuvre toward the contact, and asks the other ships not to break formation while one of them works on the target. In the bow section of HMS Vedette, the crew prepare the Hedgehog anti-submarine spigot mortar for a salvo, checking that all 24 projectiles are properly seated on their launch spigots. The Hedgehog is designed so that its projectiles fly forward a distance of about 180 to 200 meters and explode only on direct contact with the target's hull, without detonating by depth alone. This makes it possible to attack a submarine before it slips into the dead zone under the stern and out of reach of ordinary depth charges. But in order for the pattern to fall in the right place, on the bridge they calculate the speed, course and the assumed position of the target at the moment of impact, not forgetting about drift, which in such weather changes the picture in a matter of seconds. When the calculations are finished, the officer gives the order, and the metal bodies leave the spigots one after another into the grey air above the sea. Each projectile weighs several dozen kilograms and under its own weight quickly goes down into the water column, disappearing beneath the crests before the lookouts can follow the full trajectory. In the wheelhouse, everyone watches the stopwatch, because a certain number of heartbeats pass between the salvo and any possible detonation, and that time stretches especially long. Then from below comes a muffled thump, different from the sound of the projectile's own explosion, and the corvette's hull gives a slight tremor, as if the pressure somewhere below has changed. The sonar operator reports that the propeller noises he was hearing before have cut off sharply, and then turned into a disordered scraping and separate bursts of air. On the surface some time later, in the area where the submarine was presumed to be, a dark oil patch appears that does not trail away in a narrow streak, but spreads out, Covering a growing area, HMS Vidette passes along the edge of this patch at slow speed, and the lookouts scan through binoculars, trying to spot wreckage or air bubbles that sometimes rise from a destroyed hull. A note with the coordinates and time of a possible kill goes into the log, because in night and storm conditions no one can provide any other kind of confirmation. The corvette returns to the convoy, and on her bow there is still the smell of propellant gases from the Hedgehog mixed with the salty wind. Meanwhile, the worsening weather and growing sea mean that Convoy ONS-5 is entering that belt of the North Atlantic, where fog and cyclones often mix, turning the ocean into a continuous grey corridor. Visibility drops to a few hundred metres, and in such murk, even the merchant ships sometimes see only the next vessel, and beyond that just a white wall. For submarines, this used to be an advantage because they could come closer while remaining invisible to the eye and launch torpedoes from short range. Now, however, it is in these very conditions that the Allies gain a chance to use their equipment in ways that were not yet possible in the earlier years of the Battle of the Atlantic. At one of Britain's coastal airfields, the crew of a long-range patrol bomber, consolidated B-24 Liberator, receive orders to fly out into the area, where interception groups are operating against Convoy ONS-5. In the nose compartment of the aircraft, they switch on the ASV Mk.III centimetric air-to-surface radar set, designed to search for submarines on the surface and at shallow depth. ASV Mk.III works on a wavelength that the older German radar warning receivers cannot detect, which means the boat may not realise it has been found until the aircraft is already on its attack run. Under the B-24 Liberator's wings hang depth bombs with hydrostatic fuses set to specific depths to catch the target even if it tries to escape downward. The aircraft reaches the assigned grid square, and at first the ASV Mk.III operator sees only chaotic returns from wave crests on the screen, then a single dot that stays in one place longer than the background clutter. The navigator gives the pilot a small course correction of a few degrees to bring the target exactly into the centre of the screen, and the pilot holds altitude at about 150 metres above the sea surface. They keep the speed at around 300 km per hour, which is enough to make a second pass if needed without losing contact. When the return on the screen stabilises, the crew lines the aircraft up on the attack heading and prepare to release the weapons. Below, the German submarine is running on the surface to charge its batteries and refresh the air in the compartments after the night attack. Several men are standing on the bridge of the conning tower, watching the sea around them and listening for sounds, but the fog closes down the view, leaving only a narrow strip of water along the side. The sound of the approaching B-24 Liberator is almost lost in the wind and waves, and there's not a single clear line on the horizon to show that something is coming from above. When the first bombs hit the water at some distance from the boat, there is just enough time to get the men below and give the order for an emergency dive. The depth charges detonate almost at once, and several tall water columns rise above the surface, then fall together into a broad swell. In the fog, these splashes are seen only by the aircraft crew, but on the decks of the escort ships a few miles away a dull roll reaches their ears, different from ordinary thunder. After some time, a message comes over the air from the B-24 Liberator, reporting an oil patch and remnants of foam observed in the area of the submarine's presumed position. These data are compared with what has been plotted from HF/DF and Type 271, and on the chart near the convoy another point appears where a German boat no longer poses a threat. By nightfall there are several such points, because the combination of Type 271, HF/DF, Hedgehog, and long-range patrols by B-24 Liberators with ASV Mk.III allows the escort not only to repel attacks, but to force combat on their own terms. Submarines that were used to working out of darkness and fog now meet a response that arrives before they can take up a favourable position for a torpedo salvo. The bridges of the escort ships are still wet and cold, The signal lights still sway at the ends of the masts, but the entries in the logs now include coordinates not only of losses, but also of destroyed targets. Convoy ONS-5 continues its westward movement in the same storm waves, but the night sea around it no longer belongs only to those who attack from beneath the water. By the morning of the 6th of May, the storm has not eased, but around the convoy it is noticeably quieter than in the middle of the night. On the escort ships, the Type 271 screens no longer show a scatter of returns, but an even circle of coverage where only their own ships and a few echoes from high crests are visible. In the radio rooms, the HF/DF sets show isolated spikes, but they do not build into a dense picture of a radio network, as used to happen when submarines were sending long reports about shadowing convoys. In the duty officers' logs, the lines now carry the coordinates of places where oil patches were seen during the night, splashes from the use of Hedgehog, and the positions of depth charge patterns. When the fog thins a little and grey light breaks through the clouds, the overall result of the fighting around ONS-5 in the past days becomes clearer. The convoy has lost several merchant ships, including vessels from the United Kingdom, Canada and the United States, and these losses are entered separately by name and flag. British documents already list at least 6 submarines which, in connection with the battle for this convoy, are recorded as missing or badly damaged. For those standing on deck in soaked clothing, this is expressed not in numbers but in black streaks of oil on the waves, wreckage in the water and the occasional shout from boats that are still searching for people in the cold ocean. On HMS Vedette and the other corvettes of Group B7, they continue to carry out the routine duties of an escort, although in the past 24 hours they have spent more time attacking than in quiet convoy shepherding petty officers, walk along guardrails and lashings, checking that the lashings of life rafts have not slackened and that hatches over compartments have not been torn loose by the sea. In the engine rooms they monitor vibration after long spells at full power during attacks and manoeuvres, because heavy water and constant loads can cause cracks in parts on which the whole propulsion system depends. On the bridges they note that despite the storm and torpedo hits the column formation has been kept, and in the fresh radio summaries there are now not only reports of losses but also entries on enemy submarines sunk in the same area. In parallel with the battle around ONS-5, other convoys such as SC-129 and SC-130 are passing through these same latitudes, and some submarines that did not succeed against one convoy shift to search for the next target. In Allied summaries for late April and May, there are notes on several sailings where submarines suffered heavy losses while trying to attack large convoys. Over the North Atlantic there are now not only British patrol aircraft at work, but also United States anti-submarine aircraft, which cover stretches of ocean previously considered out of reach for aviation from shore bases. On the escort ship centimetric radar, HF/DF, direction finders and anti-submarine mortars are used as standard tools, and storm and fog no longer give submarines the cover they counted on at the start of the war. On one of the European coasts, at the Befehlshaber der U-Boote headquarters, the big charts of the North Atlantic still carry interception lines drawn along the convoy routes. Officers compile the reports on Convoy ONS-5 and the SC series convoys, and in the columns, ships sunk and submarine losses, new figures appear that differ markedly from those of 1941 and 1942. In May 1943, the U-boat force loses several dozen boats, and this number approaches about 40 units, while the tonnage of sunken merchant shipping no longer outweighs these losses by earlier standards. The notes to the summary state that new radars, HF/DF direction finders, anti-submarine mortars and long-range aircraft make attacks on convoys in the central North Atlantic significantly more risky for submarine crews. By the end of the month, these summaries add up to a single picture in which the Wolfpack tactic that had brought major success just a year earlier gradually stops delivering the expected result. The ratio between sunken merchant tonnage and numbers of submarines lost shifts against Germany, and each new boat that does not return from station means the loss not only of a hull but of a trained crew. The reports stress that convoys now meet submarines with organised fire and coordinated attacks from air and sea, rather than with the occasional single depth charge run of the early campaign. On the charts, next to the old interception lines, notes appear marking areas where use of the previous scheme is no longer recommended. On 24th May 1943, an order is issued instructing submarines to suspend operations for the time being against large convoys in the central North Atlantic and withdraw to other ocean areas. The document speaks of the changed situation and the strengthening of Allied anti-submarine measures, and of the need to preserve the U-boat fleet for other theatres, including areas off Africa and the Bay of Biscay. For crews that only recently were sailing with the expectation of long hunts between Greenland and the British Isles, this means abandoning the old interception lines that formed the backbone of their tactics. On the charts, new operating zones are marked away from those areas where radar, HF/DF and aviation have already proved effective. On board Convoy ONS-5, no one at that moment is reading the text of the order. Here they continue to watch the weather, fuel consumption, and the stability of the formation, because there is still a long way to go before the Canadian coast. For those standing watch at the Type 271 screens and HF/DF dials, it is more important whether the sector is clear, whether there are any unusual returns, and whether any German transmissions can be heard in the ether. In personal diaries, if anyone still has the strength to keep them, short notes appear about when they last saw a splash from a torpedo hit, and when they last hauled people out of the cold water. Only later, when the reports are brought together in general tables, will this convoy's passage and the May fighting around it stand alongside those events that will be called the Black May of the German U-boat fleet, and mark the point after which the Allied convoy's route across the Atlantic begins to open wider.